Margaret Whitmore had always prided herself on running a pristine household. Every surface gleamed, every corner remained dust-free, and every rule was followed to the letter. When she married Thomas Blackwood 3 months ago, she inherited not just his vast estate but also his 3 peculiar children from his deceased first wife. The triplets were trouble. Pure, unadulterated trouble. At 15 years old, Adrian, Elena, and Marcus possessed an otherworldly beauty that made visitors stare too long. Their pale skin seemed to glow in moonlight, their eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older, and they moved with a grace that defied their teenage years. But Margaret saw only defiance in those ancient-looking eyes. Thomas worked late most evenings at his investment firm, leaving Margaret alone to manage his unruly offspring. She had rules. Simple rules that any civilized child should follow. Be home by sunset. No friends over without permission. Attend every family meal. Complete homework before any recreational activities. The triplets treated her rules like suggestions. Tonight was the final straw. Margaret had prepared an elaborate dinner for Thomas's business associate, Mr. Henderson, who was considering a major investment opportunity. She had spent hours in the kitchen, polishing silverware, arranging flowers, ensuring everything was perfect. The triplets were nowhere to be found. She had called for them twice. Their bedrooms were empty, windows open, crisp October air flowing through white curtains. At 17 minutes past 7, with Mr. Henderson already seated in the dining room making polite conversation with Thomas, Margaret's patience snapped. She found them in the garden. All 3 sat beneath the ancient oak tree, books scattered around them, looking perfectly innocent except for the fact that they should have been at the dinner table 20 minutes ago. Elena was reading what appeared to be a leather-bound journal, while Adrian and Marcus were engaged in quiet conversation that stopped the moment they sensed her approach. Inside. Now. Margaret's voice cut through the evening air like ice. Our guest has been waiting, and your father is making excuses for your absence. Adrian looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes reflecting the last traces of daylight. We lost track of time. We'll be right in. You will be right in because I am telling you to be right in. Not because you feel like it. Margaret stepped closer, her heels clicking against the stone path. I am tired of your complete disrespect for this family's rules and routines. Elena closed the leather journal carefully, her movements deliberate. Margaret, we apologize for being late. It won't happen again. The use of her first name instead of any maternal title sent fury shooting through Margaret's chest. She had been trying for 3 months to establish her authority in this house, and these children treated her like an unwelcome visitor. It certainly won't happen again because there will be consequences this time. You 3 seem to think that because your father spoils you, you can ignore every rule I set for this household. Marcus stood up, brushing dirt from his dark jeans. At 15, he was already taller than most grown men, with the same unsettling beauty as his siblings. We understand you're upset. We'll go inside now. You'll go inside when I'm finished talking. Margaret's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain composure. I have had enough of your attitude, your mysterious disappearances, your complete inability to follow simple instructions. Normal children do not behave this way. The words hung in the air like poison. Adrian's expression darkened, and, for a moment, something flickered behind his eyes that made Margaret take an involuntary step backward. But, the moment passed, and he simply nodded. You're right. We apologize for disrupting your dinner party. His calm acceptance somehow made her angrier. She wanted them to argue back, to give her a reason to unleash the full force of her frustration. Instead, they stood there looking beautiful and mysterious and completely unmoved by her authority. Your apologies mean nothing when you repeat the same behavior over and over again. I am your stepmother, and you will show me respect in this house. You will follow my rules. You will participate in family obligations. And you will stop acting like you're above the normal expectations that apply to every other teenager in this world. Elena stepped forward, her dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. Margaret, we truly don't mean to cause problems. We'll try to do better. Try isn't good enough anymore. Margaret could feel her carefully constructed composure cracking. Your father may be content to let you run wild, but I will not tolerate it. There will be structure in this house. There will be discipline. And, if you cannot adapt to living in a civilized household, perhaps you need to consider whether this is the right place for you. The silence that followed was complete. Even the evening birds seemed to stop singing. Adrian exchanged a glance with his siblings, and Margaret caught something that looked almost like concern pass between them. Good. Maybe they were finally understanding that she meant business. We'll go inside now, Marcus said quietly. And we'll apologize to Mr. Henderson for our lateness. You will do more than apologize. You will be charming and polite and make up for the poor impression you've already made. And tomorrow, we're going to have a serious conversation about rules and consequences in this house. The triplets nodded in unison and began walking toward the house, leaving Margaret standing alone beneath the oak tree. She should have felt victorious. She had finally laid down the law, established her authority, made it clear that their behavior would no longer be tolerated. Instead, she felt strangely hollow. There had been something in their eyes during her tirade. Not fear or anger or even resentment. Something deeper and older and infinitely sadder than she had expected to see in 15-year-old faces. Margaret shook off the feeling and followed them inside. Thomas needed to see that she could handle his children, that she was capable of bringing order to this household. Mr. Henderson needed to see a united, functional family that reflected well on Thomas's stability and character. The dining room buzzed with pleasant conversation when she entered. The triplets had taken their seats and were engaging Mr. Henderson in discussion about his recent trip to Scotland. Adrian was asking thoughtful questions about the architecture, Elena was listening with genuine interest to stories about Highland folklore, and Marcus was sharing his knowledge of Scottish history with surprising depth. They were perfect dinner companions. Polite, intelligent, charming in exactly the way Margaret had demanded. So why did she feel like something was terribly wrong? Thomas caught her eye and smiled, clearly pleased that his children were making such a good impression. Mr. Henderson was thoroughly enchanted, laughing at Adrian's dry observations and praising Elena's insights about traditional Scottish music. Margaret took her seat and tried to shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. The conversation flowed around her, touching on travel, literature, current events. The triplets contributed thoughtfully to each topic, displaying knowledge that seemed far beyond their years. Mr. Henderson complimented Thomas on raising such remarkable children. They're quite extraordinary, he said, cutting into his perfectly prepared lamb. You don't often meet teenagers with such poise and intelligence. And their interest in history is impressive. Most young people their age are too busy with social media and video games to care about anything that happened before they were born. Thomas beamed with pride. They've always been advanced for their age. Their mother was brilliant, and she made sure they received an excellent education before she passed. Margaret noticed that none of the children flinched at the mention of their mother. They simply continued eating, as composed as ever. She had never seen them display any grief about their mother's death, which had occurred when they were only 7 years old. Most children would carry some visible scars from such a loss. These three seemed untouched by it. Margaret has been wonderful about continuing their education, Thomas continued, reaching over to squeeze her hand. She's brought so much structure and organization to our home life. The triplets all looked at her with expressions of polite agreement. Not a trace of the tension from the garden remained visible. They were the picture of well-behaved children who respected their stepmother's authority. Margaret smiled and accepted the compliment, but something cold was settling in her stomach. After Mr. Henderson left, praising the evening and promising to call about the investment opportunity, the family cleaned up in harmonious efficiency. The triplets cleared dishes, wiped surfaces, and put everything away without being asked. They wished Margaret and Thomas good night and headed upstairs to their rooms. Thomas pulled Margaret into his arms in the kitchen, clearly pleased with how the evening had gone. "Thank you," he said, kissing her forehead. "I know the children can be challenging sometimes, but they were perfect tonight. Whatever you said to them earlier must have gotten through." Margaret nodded and smiled, but the cold feeling in her stomach was spreading. She had gotten through to them. They had followed her instructions to the letter, been exactly what she had demanded they be. So why did it feel like they were humoring her instead of respecting her? And why did she suddenly feel like she was the child in this house, being managed by teenagers who were far too good at giving adults exactly what they wanted to see? That night, Margaret lay awake listening to the sounds of the old house settling around them. Thomas slept peacefully beside her, satisfied that his family was finally finding its rhythm. But Margaret stared at the ceiling and wondered what she had really seen in the triplets' eyes during her outburst in the garden. It hadn't been fear or rebellion or even ordinary teenage sullenness. It had been pity. As if they were looking at someone who had no idea what she was dealing with. Someone who was making threats she couldn't possibly follow through on because she didn't understand the first thing about who they really were. The thought should have made her angry. Instead, it made her feel very small and very alone in the large, dark house. Outside her window, she could hear the faint sound of voices in the garden. Young voices, speaking too quietly for her to make out words but with an urgency that made her skin prickle. The triplets were supposed to be asleep in their rooms. Margaret slipped out of bed and moved to the window, careful not to wake Thomas. She peered through the curtains into the moonlit garden below. 3 figures stood beneath the oak tree where she had confronted them earlier. They were clearly the triplets, but something about their posture and movements seemed different. Older. More purposeful. They were talking to someone else. A 4th figure, tall and imposing, partially hidden in the shadows cast by the tree's massive trunk. Margaret's breath caught. Who would be meeting her stepchildren in their garden at nearly midnight? And why did the sight of that shadowy figure fill her with a dread that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than rational concern? She watched as the conversation continued, too far away and too quiet for her to hear. The mysterious figure seemed to be listening intently as the triplets spoke, occasionally nodding or gesturing. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the meeting ended. The 4th figure melted back into the shadows with movements that seemed impossibly fluid, while the triplets headed toward the house. Margaret hurried back to bed, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. Minutes later, she heard the soft sounds of the triplets entering the house through what must have been a door downstairs. Footsteps on the stairs. Doors closing quietly in the hallway. They had snuck out after everyone was asleep and met with a stranger in the garden. This was exactly the kind of behavior that proved she was right to demand more structure and oversight. She should wake Thomas. She should confront them first thing in the morning. She should demand an explanation and impose serious consequences. But something stopped her. The image of that shadowy figure haunted her. There had been something about the way it moved, the way the triplets had deferred to it, that suggested this was not a typical teenage rebellion situation. Margaret pulled the covers up to her chin and tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. Teenagers snuck out to meet friends. It was normal behavior, even if it was unacceptable behavior. But, as she finally drifted toward sleep, one thought kept circling through her mind. The figure in the shadows had been watching them during dinner from outside the dining room window. She was suddenly, impossibly certain of it. Someone had been observing her confrontation with the triplets in the garden. Someone had witnessed her angry demands and threats. And, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand, that realization filled her with a terror that had nothing to do with normal parental concerns about her stepchildren's safety. The last thing she remembered before sleep finally claimed her was the sound of footsteps on the roof above their bedroom. Slow, deliberate footsteps that moved with inhuman grace across the tiles. But that had to be her imagination. Had to be. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October could provide. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Margaret prepared breakfast, determined to address the previous night's garden meeting with the triplets. She had rehearsed her speech while Thomas showered, planning to be firm but fair in demanding explanations. The triplets entered the kitchen precisely at 7:30, dressed for school and carrying their backpacks. Their synchronized timing should have seemed normal for siblings, but something about their coordination always struck Margaret as slightly unnatural. "Good morning, Margaret," Elena said pleasantly, setting her bag down by the counter. Her long dark hair was braided with mathematical precision, not a strand out of place. "Good morning," Margaret replied, studying their faces for any sign of guilt or defiance about their midnight excursion. "I trust you all slept well." "Very well, thank you," Adrian answered, accepting the plate of scrambled eggs she offered. His pale blue eyes met hers with complete innocence. Marcus nodded his agreement while pouring orange juice for himself and his siblings. The evening air was quite refreshing last night. Perfect sleeping weather. The comment felt pointed, but Margaret couldn't be certain. These children had a way of speaking that made her question whether she was reading meanings into perfectly innocent statements. "About yesterday evening," she began carefully, "I want you to know that while I may have been harsh in the garden, I was coming from a place of caring about this family's success. Mr. Henderson was very impressed with your behavior at dinner." "We're glad we could make a good impression," Elena said. "We understand how important his investment opportunity is to Father." Margaret waited for more. An acknowledgement of her authority, perhaps, or an apology for their initial lateness. Instead, the triplets continued eating with the same serene composure they always displayed. "I also want to discuss household rules moving forward," she continued. "I think we need clearer expectations about evening activities and curfews." Adrian looked up from his breakfast. "Of course. What would you like those expectations to be?" His immediate compliance should have been gratifying. Instead, Margaret found herself feeling manipulated, though she couldn't pinpoint why. These were the responses she wanted, the respect she had demanded. "Well, I think 10 o'clock is a reasonable bedtime for school nights. And I'd like to know if any of you plan to spend time in the garden during the evening hours." "For safety reasons." "That sounds very reasonable," Marcus agreed. "We'll make sure to inform you of our whereabouts." Thomas entered the kitchen then, already dressed for work and checking his phone for messages. He kissed Margaret's cheek and smiled at his children. "Good morning, you three. Ready for another day of academic excellence?" "Always," Elena replied with a small smile that seemed genuinely warm when directed at her father. Margaret watched the interaction with growing unease. The affection between Thomas and his children was real and deep. They clearly loved him, and he adored them. So why does she feel like she was observing something being performed for her benefit? After Thomas left for work and the triplets departed for school, Margaret found herself alone with her thoughts and an increasingly uncomfortable certainty that she was missing something crucial about her new family. She decided to use her day productively by learning more about the children she was trying to parent. Their rooms might provide insights into their personalities, interests, and, perhaps, explanations for their unusual behavior. Adrian's room was the first she entered. It was immaculately clean, as she had expected. Books lined built-in shelves along one wall, but these were not typical teenage reading material. Philosophy texts, historical biographies, and what appeared to be academic journals on subjects ranging from anthropology to astronomy filled the shelves. His desk held a leather journal similar to the one Elena had been reading in the garden, along with fountain pens and a brass letter opener that looked antique. No computer, no gaming systems, no typical teenage possessions. The strangest detail was the absence of mirrors. Not one reflective surface existed in the room, which struck Margaret as odd for a teenage boy. Elena's room was equally pristine and equally unusual. Her bookshelf contained literature in multiple languages, including several that Margaret couldn't identify. French poetry sat next to Russian novels and what appeared to be texts in Latin or perhaps Italian. Like her brother's room, Elena's space contained no mirrors, no computer, and nothing that suggested typical teenage interests. Instead, Margaret found art supplies, but not ordinary ones. Charcoal pencils, expensive paper, and what looked like professional-grade materials for detailed portraiture. A portfolio leaning against the wall caught her attention. Margaret hesitated, then decided that as their guardian, she had a right to understand their activities and interests. The drawings inside made her breath catch. Each page showed portraits of extraordinary skill and detail. But these were not drawings of classmates or family members. Every face was that of an adult, and every expression carried a weight of years that seemed impossible for a 15-year-old to capture. More disturbing was the recurring theme. Every portrait showed its subject with an expression of profound sadness or loss. The technique was masterful, but the emotional content was deeply unsettling. At the bottom of the portfolio, Margaret found several sketches that made her hands tremble. These drawings showed the same faces, but with different expressions. Joy, love, hope, contentment. And, in the corner of each page, a date. The date spanned over 200 years. Margaret's rational mind insisted this was some kind of art project about historical figures or perhaps copies of existing portraits. But the style was consistent across all the drawings, suggesting they were created by the same artist over time. Which was impossible. Marcus's room yielded the most disturbing discovery of all. Like his siblings, he owned no mirrors and no typical teenage possessions. His bookshelves contained texts on military history, strategy, and what appeared to be genealogical research. But, tucked away in his desk drawer, Margaret found a collection of newspaper clippings. Missing persons reports. Dating back decades. Each clipping was carefully preserved, and many were marked with handwritten notes in the margins. Not random newspaper collecting, but purposeful research with a focus she couldn't understand. Margaret sat in Marcus's desk chair, newspaper clippings spread before her, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. These children were not normal 15-year-olds. Their possessions, their interests, their knowledge, their behavior, all pointed to something far beyond typical teenage complexity. The rational explanations felt increasingly thin. Gifted children, perhaps. Unusual upbringing following their mother's death. Thomas's wealth allowing for exceptional education and experiences. But the missing mirrors troubled her. The advanced knowledge in their conversations. The way they moved with grace that seemed learned over years rather than natural teenage development. And the newspaper clippings in Marcus's room suggested an awareness of dark subjects that no 15-year-old should possess. Margaret was replacing the clippings when she heard the front door open downstairs. The children were home from school, earlier than she had expected. She closed Marcus's desk drawer and hurried downstairs, trying to compose herself and plan how to address her discoveries without seeming invasive. But the triplets were not alone. Standing in the foyer with them was a man Margaret had never seen before. Tall, imposing, and dressed in an expensive dark suit that seemed perfectly tailored. His presence filled the space in a way that made the large foyer feel small and cramped. "Margaret," Elena said with her typical politeness, "we'd like you to meet our uncle, Vincent Blackwood. He's Thomas's brother." Margaret stared. Thomas had never mentioned having a brother. In fact, she was certain he had told her he was an only child, with no surviving family other than his children. Vincent Blackwood stepped forward and extended his hand. His smile was charming, but something about his dark eyes made Margaret hesitate before accepting the handshake. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said in a voice that was cultured and smooth. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I was in the area on business and wanted to meet my brother's new wife." His handshake was firm and cold, far colder than the October weather could explain. And when Margaret looked into his eyes, she felt the same inexplicable dread that had gripped her while watching the shadowy figure in the garden. "I didn't realize Thomas had a brother," she said carefully. "He's never mentioned you." Vincent's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his expression. "We've been estranged for some time. Family disagreements, you understand. But recent events have made me realize how important family connections truly are." The triplets stood slightly behind their uncle, watching the interaction with expressions Margaret couldn't read. But their body language suggested deference, even reverence, toward this man who claimed to be their relative. "Where are my manners?" Margaret said, falling back on social conditioning. "Please, come into the living room. Can I offer you something to drink?" "That's very kind, but I can't stay long. I simply wanted to introduce myself and ensure that you're settling in well with the children." They moved to the living room, where Vincent took a seat in the wingback chair that typically belonged to Thomas. The triplets arranged themselves on the sofa with their usual synchronized precision. "The children have been adjusting beautifully to our new family dynamic," Margaret said, though the words felt hollow given her recent discoveries. "They're remarkably well-behaved and intelligent." "Yes," Vincent said, his gaze moving to his nieces and nephew with unmistakable pride. "They've always been extraordinary. Their mother raised them with very specific values and expectations." Something in his tone when he mentioned their mother made Margaret's skin prickle. Not grief or fondness, but something deeper and more complex. "I understand she passed away when they were quite young," Margaret said. "It must have been difficult for them." "Death is always difficult," Vincent replied. "But these three have learned to adapt to loss in ways that would surprise most people." Adrian spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Uncle Vincent, perhaps we should let Margaret know that you'll be staying in town for a few weeks, in case Father would like to reach out." "Of course," Vincent said. "I'm hoping Thomas and I can resolve our past differences." "Family unity becomes more important as time passes, don't you think, Mrs. Blackwood?" Margaret nodded, though she felt increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. There were undercurrents here that she couldn't follow, references to things she didn't understand. "I should let you get back to your afternoon," Vincent said, rising with fluid grace. "But I hope we'll have the opportunity to speak again soon. I find myself very curious about your perspective on the children's development and their future needs." The way he said future needs sent a chill through Margaret that she couldn't explain. The triplets walked their uncle to the door while Margaret remained in the living room, processing the encounter. She could hear quiet conversation in the foyer, but the words were too low to make out. When the children returned, they seemed different somehow. More relaxed, perhaps, or more confident. As if Vincent's visit had reassured them about something. "Your uncle seems very distinguished," Margaret said carefully. "I'm surprised Thomas never mentioned him." "Family relationships can be complicated," Elena said. "But we're hoping they can reconnect now." "Will he be attending dinner with us this week? I'd like Thomas to know he's in town." The triplets exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Marcus answered. "Uncle Vincent prefers evening meetings. Perhaps they could arrange something after Father returns from work." Evening meetings. Like the midnight gathering Margaret had witnessed in the garden. She was beginning to suspect that Vincent Blackwood was the shadowy figure she had seen the night before. Which meant he had been watching during her confrontation with the children, listening to her demands and threats about structure and discipline. The thought made her feel exposed and foolish in ways she couldn't articulate. That evening, Margaret waited until the triplets were supposedly asleep before telling Thomas about Vincent's visit. Thomas's reaction was immediate and concerning. "Vincent was here?" His face went pale, and he set down his evening brandy with hands that trembled slightly. "Are you certain that's who he said he was?" "He introduced himself as your brother. The children called him Uncle Vincent." "Why didn't you tell me you had a brother?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his brandy as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "Because Vincent has been dead for over a century," he said finally. "He died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. Along with the rest of my family." Margaret felt the world shift slightly around her. "That's impossible. I spoke with him. I shook his hand. Describe him to me." Margaret provided the details she could remember. Tall, dark-haired, expensively dressed, cold hands, commanding presence. As she spoke, Thomas's expression grew more troubled. "That sounds like Vincent," he admitted. "But, Margaret, I buried my brother myself in 1918. I was barely 20 years old, and I lost everyone I had left in the world except for my wife and the children." "Thomas, that doesn't make sense. You're 52 years old. You couldn't have buried anyone in 1918. Another long silence. Thomas looked up at her with eyes that suddenly seemed to carry a weight of years that didn't match his appearance. "Margaret, there are things about my family that I should have told you before we married. Things that I hoped you might never need to know. The cold dread Margaret had been fighting for days crystallized into terror. What kind of things? The kind of things that explain why my children don't eat normal food, why they've never aged properly, and why they can't see their reflections in mirrors. Margaret stared at her husband, the man she had married 3 months ago, and realized she didn't know him at all. What are you saying? Thomas met her eyes with an expression of profound sadness. I'm saying that if Vincent is truly back, then someone in this family has broken the most important rule we've lived by for over a century. And I'm afraid that someone might be you. Margaret's world shattered completely as Thomas explained the impossible truth that governed their lives. The Blackwood family was not human. They were vampires, an ancient bloodline that had survived for centuries by maintaining careful balance between their supernatural nature and the mortal world around them. Thomas had been transformed in 1897, during the height of Victorian England, when he was 25 years old. His maker had been Vincent, his older brother who had received the gift decades earlier. The entire Blackwood line had been converted over the span of 50 years, creating a family of immortals bound by blood and ancient laws. We lived together for 20 years before the pandemic, Thomas explained, his voice heavy with memories Margaret could barely comprehend. Vincent was our patriarch, our leader, our king if you will. He made the rules that kept us safe and secret. The influenza pandemic of 1918 had been their downfall. Not because the disease could kill them, but because their feeding habits during that time of mass death had drawn attention from others of their kind. Hunters. Vampire hunters who had tracked them across Europe and, finally, cornered them in London. Vincent sacrificed himself to save the rest of us, Thomas said. He drew the hunters away and fought them alone, knowing he couldn't survive against so many. He died protecting us, and, with his death, the bloodline was broken. Margaret listened in horrified fascination as Thomas described their escape to America, where they had lived in hiding for over a century. He had eventually found love with Isabella, a mortal woman who had accepted their nature and helped them blend into human society. Isabella knew what we were from the beginning, Thomas said. She helped us establish new identities, new lives. When she became pregnant with the triplets, we hoped they might be born mortal, able to live normal human lives. Instead, the children had inherited their father's supernatural nature. They aged slowly, possessed enhanced strength and speed, and required blood for sustenance. But they had also inherited their mother's humanity, making them something unique in the vampire world. Dampiers, Thomas said. Half mortal, half vampire. Incredibly rare and incredibly powerful. Isabella raised them to control their nature, to live peacefully among humans. Isabella's death 8 years ago had been from cancer, a mortal disease that even vampire blood couldn't cure. The triplets had been 7 years old enough to understand loss but young enough to adapt to living with only their father's guidance. I thought we were safe, Thomas said. I thought Vincent was truly gone, and we could continue living quietly among humans. I never imagined that marriage to a mortal woman who didn't understand our nature could summon him back. Margaret's mind reeled. How could my marriage summon a dead vampire? Because you threatened his bloodline. You yelled at his descendants, challenged their autonomy, demanded they submit to mortal authority. In the supernatural world, such behavior toward vampire royalty is considered a declaration of war. The midnight meeting in the garden made terrible sense now. The triplets had been reporting to their returned patriarch, explaining the situation with their new stepmother who didn't understand what she was dealing with. So Vincent is back from the dead because I tried to parent his great-nieces and nephew? Vincent isn't back from the dead, Thomas corrected quietly. Vincent never died. He's been in exile, cast out from vampire society for breaking ancient laws. But threats to his bloodline can call him back, can restore his power and position. Margaret felt sick. What laws did he break? He loved a mortal woman. More than that, he chose her over his vampire duties. In 1918, he was supposed to eliminate a threat to vampire secrecy, but he refused because it would have meant killing the woman he loved. His defiance got other vampires killed, and he was stripped of his position and banished. The room felt too small suddenly. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where she had confronted the triplets just one night ago. What does he want now? Justice. Retribution. He's the rightful king of our bloodline, and you challenged his authority over his descendants. In vampire law, that requires a response. Margaret turned back to her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time since they had met. The slight pallor of his skin, the way he never seemed to eat much at meals, his preference for rare meat and wine over other foods. The signs had been there, but she had explained them away as quirks of personality. Are you going to kill me? Thomas looked stricken. I would never hurt you, Margaret. But I can't protect you from Vincent if he decides you violated supernatural law. What can I do? Apologize. Show respect for the children's true nature. Accept that they are not ordinary teenagers who can be governed by ordinary rules. Margaret thought about the newspaper clippings in Marcus's room, the ancient knowledge in Adrian's books, the skilled portraits Elena created showing centuries of faces and emotions. How old are they really? In vampire terms, they're children. But they've lived for 8 years since their mother's death, learning to navigate both supernatural abilities and mortal society. They know things most teenagers never learn because they have to. Their survival depends on understanding both worlds. The weight of her mistake began to settle on Margaret's shoulders. She had treated supernatural beings like unruly children, demanded they submit to her authority without understanding that they were connected to powers and hierarchies far beyond mortal comprehension. Will Vincent meet with me? I don't know. He's here to evaluate the threat you represent to his bloodline. If he determines you're dangerous to their safety or secrecy, he'll eliminate that threat. Margaret spent that night lying awake, processing the impossible reality of her situation. She had married into a family of vampires and unknowingly declared war on their patriarch by trying to establish parental authority over his supernatural descendants. The next morning brought a formal invitation. Margaret found an envelope slipped under her bedroom door while she was brushing her teeth. Heavy paper, elegant script, and a wax seal that looked genuinely antique. Mrs. Blackwood, the letter read, I request your presence in the garden at sunset this evening for a formal discussion of recent events. Come alone. Your husband and the children will not be harmed regardless of our conversation's outcome, but your future depends entirely on your willingness to understand the gravity of your situation. Vincent Blackwood. Margaret showed the letter to Thomas, who went pale again. He's giving you a chance to explain yourself, he said. That's more consideration than most mortals receive when they violate vampire law. What should I say to him? The truth. That you didn't understand what you were dealing with, and that you're willing to learn. That evening, Margaret dressed carefully and walked into the garden alone. The autumn air was crisp, and sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for meeting a vampire king. Vincent waited beneath the oak tree, looking exactly as distinguished as he had the day before. But now Margaret could see the supernatural quality in his stillness, the way his eyes reflected the dying light, the aura of power that surrounded him like an invisible crown. Mrs. Blackwood, he said formally. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain myself. Vincent gestured for her to sit on a stone bench near the tree. He remained standing, a position that emphasized his authority while making clear this was not a casual conversation between equals. Tell me about your interaction with my descendants 2 nights ago. Margaret had rehearsed this explanation, but facing Vincent made her preparation feel inadequate. She described her frustration with the triplets' behavior, her desire to establish structure in the household, and her anger at their apparent disrespect for her authority. I see, Vincent said when she finished. And what did you hope to accomplish with your discipline? I wanted them to understand that I care about this family's success. I wanted to feel like I belonged in this household, like I had some role in their lives beyond just being their father's wife. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, studying her with eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. You feel displaced in your own home, he said finally. You married Thomas hoping to create a family, but instead you found children who didn't need you in the ways you expected. Margaret nodded, surprised by his understanding. And, so you attempted to force them into roles that would validate your position as their maternal figure? Yes. But, I understand now that I was wrong. I didn't know what they really were, what their family really was. Indeed. You were treating vampire royalty like disobedient human children. In supernatural society, such behavior would typically result in immediate execution. Margaret's breath caught, but Vincent raised a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. However, he continued, the children have spoken on your behalf. They believe your actions came from genuine care rather than malicious intent. They value the stability you've brought to their father's life, and they're willing to forgive your ignorance if you're willing to learn. Relief flooded through Margaret, followed immediately by gratitude toward the triplets who had apparently advocated for her life. I am willing to learn, she said. I want to be part of this family, whatever that means. Vincent smiled for the first time since she had met him, and the expression transformed his entire appearance from intimidating to almost paternal. Very well. Then, your education begins now. Over the next 2 hours, Vincent explained the rules that governed vampire society and the specific responsibilities that came with being part of the Blackwood bloodline. Margaret learned about feeding requirements, territorial boundaries, the importance of secrecy, and the complex hierarchy that existed among supernatural beings. The triplets, she discovered, were not just vampire children but heirs to a royal lineage that carried significant responsibility. They would eventually need to choose between embracing their supernatural heritage or attempting to live as mortals, but that decision wouldn't come for several more decades. Your role, Vincent explained, is not to parent them in the traditional sense. They already possess the knowledge and abilities they need to survive. Instead, you can offer them something far more valuable, connection to the mortal world they may choose to join. Margaret began to understand that the triplets' apparent maturity and knowledge weren't signs of disrespect but evidence of the heavy responsibilities they carried. They were learning to navigate two completely different worlds while honoring their heritage and protecting their family's secrets. Can you accept this? Vincent asked as their conversation drew to a close. Can you love these children for what they truly are rather than what you wanted them to be? Margaret thought about Adrian's philosophical texts, Elena's centuries-spanning art, and Marcus's research into missing persons that probably represented real supernatural threats he was tracking. Yes, she said. I can. Vincent stood and offered his hand to help her up from the bench. This time, his cold grip felt protective rather than threatening. Then, welcome to the Blackwood family, Margaret. Your real education begins tomorrow. The next few weeks transformed Margaret's understanding of everything around her. Vincent remained in town, teaching her about supernatural politics, vampire history, and the specific skills she would need to support her unusual family. She learned that Thomas's investment firm was actually a front for managing supernatural assets and territories. The triplets attended a special school that catered to supernatural beings disguised as gifted humans. Even their house was warded against various supernatural threats. Most importantly, she learned to see her stepchildren as the remarkable beings they truly were. Adrian's philosophical knowledge came from decades of studying immortality and morality. Elena's artistic skill captured the emotional depth that came from understanding both human and supernatural nature. Marcus's research protected their family by tracking potential threats before they could become dangerous. They weren't rebellious teenagers ignoring her authority. They were young supernatural beings carrying responsibilities that most adults could never handle. Margaret's relationship with them deepened as she began asking questions about their interests rather than demanding compliance with arbitrary rules. She found that they were eager to share their knowledge and experiences with someone who approached their nature with curiosity rather than fear. The first time Adrian showed her one of his philosophical essays about the ethics of immortality, Margaret cried at the maturity and wisdom contained in his words. When Elena offered to teach her about supernatural art techniques, Margaret understood that she was being offered a privilege reserved for family members. And, when Marcus explained how he used newspaper clippings to track supernatural threats, she realized she had been looking at evidence of his protection rather than signs of disturbing interests. We never wanted to exclude you, Elena told her one evening as they worked on a charcoal portrait together. We just didn't know how to include you without revealing secrets that could put you in danger. I understand now, Margaret said. And I'm honored that you're willing to trust me with those secrets. Vincent eventually departed to handle supernatural business in other territories, but not before giving Margaret his approval as a true member of the Blackwood family. You've surprised me, he told her during their final conversation. Most mortals who learn our truth either flee in terror or become obsessed with gaining supernatural power. You've done neither. I just want to love them properly, Margaret said. All of them. Vincent smiled. That, my dear, is exactly what they need. Months later, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed. She still maintained the beautiful household she had always prided herself on, but now she understood that the order and structure served a deeper purpose. Their home was a sanctuary where supernatural beings could rest between the demands of their hidden world. The triplets still followed household rules, but those rules were designed to protect their secrets rather than assert Margaret's authority. They came home by sunset because that was when their supernatural nature became strongest. They attended family meals because those times allowed them to maintain their human connections. They completed their studies because education was crucial for beings who would live for centuries. Margaret's role had evolved from disciplinarian to guardian of their mortal connections. She helped them understand human emotions, navigate mortal social situations, and maintain the balance between their supernatural abilities and their human hearts. When people complimented her on her well-behaved stepchildren, Margaret smiled and accepted the praise. But now she understood that their good behavior wasn't submission to her authority. It was evidence of the love and respect they held for the family they had chosen to protect. Some evenings, Margaret would look out at the garden where her journey into this hidden world had begun and feel grateful for the misunderstanding that had brought Vincent back into their lives. Her attempt to control beings she didn't understand had ultimately taught her how to love them for exactly what they were. And, in learning to love vampires, she had discovered what family truly meant. The triplets grew slowly, as Dampiers did, gaining wisdom and ability at their own supernatural pace. Margaret grew alongside them, learning to see the world through eyes that understood both its mortal beauty and its supernatural complexity. Thomas often told her that she had brought peace to their household in ways he hadn't thought possible. Not through enforcing order, but by creating a space where supernatural beings could experience the warmth and acceptance of genuine family love. The last entry in Margaret's diary, written 3 years after Vincent's visit, read simply, "Today Elena called me Mom for the first time. Not because I demanded respect, but because I had finally earned love." Some families are built through blood, some through choice, and some through the courage to embrace the impossible. Ours was built through all three. Outside her window, 3 figures moved through the moonlit garden with inhuman grace, practicing abilities that would protect them for centuries to come. But, when they looked up and saw her watching, they waved with the simple joy of children who knew they were loved unconditionally. Margaret waved back and smiled. Her family was perfect exactly as they were.